Showrunners David Benioff and D.B. Weiss weren't the first producers to approach author George R.R. Martin about adapting his Song of Ice and Fire novels. Hollywood movie producers clamored for the rights for his series after the release of the second book in the series, The Clash of Kings, and many more after the success of the Lord of the Rings films. Martin, however, turned them all down because he didn't want his books to be adapted into films due to their sheer size. He later explained, "You would have to cut it to shreds. It took 3 films to make Lord of the Rings, and the entirety of Lord of the Rings, all 3 of Tolkien's books, is only the size of one of my books. So we're talking 20 films. What studio is going to commit to 20 films?" The thought of creating a television series instead had occurred to Martin, who'd previously worked on both Beauty and the Beast and The Twilight Zone. But the amount of censoring the books would need to go through to meet network content guidelines turned him off of the idea. Again, he explained, "We could do it for a TV series for network, but what happens then? You run into the standards and practices issues. The censors who are going to say, no, you can't have all this sex and violence. Take all that out." For years, Martin insisted that his series was unfilmable and only agreed to sell the rights to his novel after his meeting with producers David Benioff and Daniel Brett Weiss. Benioff, a longtime fan of fantasy, was first exposed to the series by Martin's agent. 300 pages into the first book, he called Weiss to suggest they pursue an adaptation of the series. Weiss read the first novel in just 36 hours and agreed to try to obtain the rights. The pair shared similar excitement and goals for the series with Martin, who agreed to let them adapt his novels after a 5-hour meeting in a restaurant on Santa Monica Boulevard. Martin was ultimately convinced by their answer to his final question, who is Jon Snow's mother? After securing the rights, Benioff and Weiss pitched the show to HBO in early 2007, who bought the series in order to pilot. However, casting wouldn't begin until 2009, with Peter Dinklage and Sean Bean announced for the roles of Tyrion Lannister and Eddard Stark, respectively. Dinklage and Bean were Benioff and Weiss's first and only choices for both roles, and in Dinklage's case, no one else even read or auditioned for that part. The pilot itself was not aired and has never been released, and though the final version of the first episode retains some scenes from the pilot, many other elements were changed upon reshooting. Several locations initially shot in Scotland were instead filmed in Ireland, and scenes filmed in Morocco were reshot in Malta. Alfie Allen retained his natural blonde hair in the pilot before it was dyed brown for the show, and both George R.R. Martin and the German band Corvus Corax had cameos that were cut from the series debut. Finally, several actors were replaced for unspecified reasons, including Tamsin Merchant as Daenerys Targaryen, Jennifer Ely as Catelyn Stark, Richard Ridings as Jared, and Jamie Campbell Bower as Waymere Royce. Roy Dotrice was also cast as Grand Maester Pycelle, but fell ill before the shooting of Season 1. He was replaced by Julian Glover and later rejoined the series as Pyromancer Halene. Though the first season of Game of Thrones attempted to stay accurate to the books, the timeline and scope of the story was stretched during the adaptation, almost exclusively because Daenerys Targaryen's relationship with Khal Drogo. The producers of the series were worried that showing sexual interactions with a character who was so young would be illegal, even if all the actors involved were legally adults. As a result, several years were added to the backstory to make everyone older. Daenerys begins the series at 16 instead of 13, and all the other younger Starks and Lannisters are preteens and young adults instead of children. And even some characters like Ned Stark and Robert Baratheon are portrayed in their 40s instead of their mid-30s, as in the books. While most other changes made in the first season were relatively minor, numerous additional scenes had to be written exclusively for the series. HBO realized late into the filming of the first season that some episodes had been projected to be far too short, resulting in supplemental materials being written to fill out the time slots. Across the entire first season, 93 pages of new material was added. However, since the season's budget had already been spent, most of these additional scenes consisted of characters that didn't have point-of-view chapters in the books talking to each other for several minutes at a time. In an attempt to keep the show's canon as aligned with the books as possible, these scenes didn't push the plot forward and were used instead for character development. A climactic battle scene between the Stark and Lannister forces from Tyrion's point of view appears in the books, but was cut from episode 9 to afford these extra scenes. It was originally planned to be shown on Steadicam over Peter Dinklage's shoulder, but instead Tyrion was knocked out at the beginning of the battle. There are several notable cameos from the Game of Thrones crew throughout the series. Noted weapons master and Game of Thrones armorer Boyd Rankin appeared in the first season as Winterfell's blacksmith Meekin. The show's weapons master, Tommy Dunn, actually appears in the series twice. First as the barber in Winterfell in the first season, and again as the Valyrian swordsmith in the fourth. One of the series' casting directors, Robert Stern, appeared as the royal steward throughout Season 1, and line producer Christopher Newman played the corpse of Lord Hoster Tully in Season 3. Finally, director Neil Marshall, who helmed both the show's acclaimed hour-long battles, Blackwater and The Watchers on the Wall, appeared in the latter as an archer with the Night's Watch. Several notable musicians have also cameoed in the shows, often putting their talents to use. Snow Patrol's lead singer Gary Lightbody appears in Season 3 as a Bolton soldier singing The Bear and the Maiden Fair, while Coldplay's percussionist Will Champion played a fray drummer later in that same season. The Icelandic post-rockers Sigur Rós portrayed the band at Joffrey and Marjorie's wedding in Season 4, and members from the heavy metal band Mastodon played wildlings at Hardhome in Season 5. Though he plays a supporting role instead of just having a cameo, the actor who portrays the character Bronn, Jerome Flynn, was part of an English pop duo in the late 90s called Robson and Jerome. His pleasant singing voice was incorporated into Bronn's character. Musicians aren't the only celebrities to have cameoed in Game of Thrones, though one did in a slightly unorthodox way. In the 10th episode of the first season, several prosthetic heads were used in a scene where King Joffrey Baratheon forces Sansa Stark to look at decapitated heads mounted on spikes. One of those heads, however, was made in the mold of the 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush. Bush's likeness was acknowledged by Benioff and Weiss during the episode's director commentary, but the pair claimed it had nothing to do with political alignment. They later explained, "We use a lot of prosthetic body parts on the show, heads, arms, etc. We can't afford to have all of these made from scratch, especially in scenes where we need a lot of them, so we rent them in bulk." After the scene was already shot, someone pointed out that one of the heads looked like George W. Bush. Regardless, having a former president's head mounted on a spike sparked a bit of outrage, causing Benioff and Weiss to publicly apologize, stating, "We meant no disrespect to the former president and apologize if anything we did or said suggested otherwise." Subsequently, HBO digitally removed the head from all future releases in the series.
You did well.
Make sure you subscribe for more facts and trivia, but before you go, we'd like you to vote on which series you'd like to see covered in the future, Doctor Who or The Walking Dead. And if you'd like to continue with some movie-related videos and see the face attached to this voice, why not check out my video on Jurassic Park? I break down a single scene that I believe is exceptional, and it's probably not the one you're thinking of.